Cool. Are y'all ready? Cool.
Alrighty, here we go. Sorry for, yep, the horrific desktop.
There's nothing like the sound of a good book review. Welcome to our review of Critical Democratic Education and LGBTQ-Inclusive Curriculum Opportunities and Constraints, hosted by the Nautical Fancies of Isabel and India. We want to thank all of you for listening and hope you have a lovely time. And don't forget to grab a Krabby Patty on your way out.
All right. Perfect. So our book, Critical Democratic Education and LGBTQ Inclusive Curriculum, explores the variety of cultural landscapes that can either hinder or provide opportunities for LGBTQ individuals. We explore the benefits of a critical democratic education that accurately represents and supports the needs of its students. And in the beginning of the book, there are three main questions that we use here to guide our book review. So the first key question is, how do public policies around schooling respond to shifts towards recognition? Um, in this book, it proposes that a democratic curriculum is necessary for LGBTQ inclusion. A democratic school governance should recognize the voices of all of its students, educators, and parents concerning what and how students learn. Undemocratic communities represent the perspectives and needs of the dominant culture, and dominant groups often define the rules of inclusion, and this is a hindrance to democracy and LGBTQ inclusion. Next slide.
All right, so here we have a quote that reads, heterosexual and cisgender individuals are reflected in the curriculum as a norm that functions to devalue the lives and experiences of LGBTQ individuals and issues. So we chose this quote because we really want to ask ourselves, well, who benefits from excluding LGBTQ perspectives from curriculum? What kind of message does this exclusion relay to students? So it really comes down to power and privilege. The individuals who are included in curriculum policymaking are those who identify with a dominant identity, aka heterosexual and cisgender individuals. So in the reading, they talk about how in a democratic community, the strength of a person's voice is reflective of the person speaking. And this is because dominant the dominant identities that recognize some people as of more or less value than others. So we think that this really tells us that schools need a curriculum that recognizes every student. So leaving content or issues out of the curriculum says to students, hey, these issues are unimportant, which then becomes the norm.
So a transformative curriculum would consider a student's intersectionality and positionality and would examine how power, education, and knowledge relate to both intersectionality and positionality. So this requires the recognition of unjust socially constructed hierarchies, such as unjust socially constructed hierarchies related to race, ethnicity, class, ability, language, geopolitical belonging, etc.
For dominant curriculum, we see LGBTQ students being affected by norms that enforce dominant ideas of gender and sexuality, resulting in students finding themselves isolated. So from the reading, it states that dominant groups often define the rules of inclusion. So a really big takeaway is that we need to take the time to really examine and identify the dominant narratives that are influential to the way that students are being instructed and how they understand the world in which they live. All right, we're going to move on to the next question. What does school resistance to these shifts tell us about the legitimacy of public education? So this reading examines example curriculum in the states of Utah and California. And these states are juxtaposed as examples of different kinds of educational policy and how curriculum can vary depending on where you are. So we also are asked to think about the consequences that can occur within environments that foster inclusive LGBTQ students and ones that do not. So we're going to go ahead and talk about those.
Cool. So Utah represents one end of the spectrum for LGBTQ students. There's a very strong link between religion and politics in Utah, and the largest religious group in the state is the Mormon Church or the LDS Church. This has created a culture where normal is defined as patriarchal gender roles and aggressive heteronormativity. So much so that the state of Utah has even tried to control the identity of its teachers. The book gave a really good example of a teacher named Wendy Weaver, who came out as a lesbian after being a teacher for 17 years, and her school placed her on a gag order because of it. A conservative group filed a suit against her saying that she should have been fired and she had to defend herself for 5 years, and she faced just like a lot of harassment from her community. And then in addition to this, there is a long history of book banning and resistance to the formation of GSAs in Utah. A book called In Our Mother's House by Polacco was under fire in Utah because it featured a child with two mothers. Parents complained that the book was promoting homosexuality. The school then moved the book to a section for older kids and required a parent's signature to check out the book. This sends the message that same-sex marriage is not viewed the same as a traditional marriage. Um, as for GSAs, there's been a long and tumultuous history surrounding them. For example, at East Lake High School in Salt Lake City in 1995, the students formed a GSA only for the school district to respond by shutting down all clubs. The Utah Eagle Forum, a conservative group, was involved in shutting down the GSA, and one of its members is quoted as saying, quote, "We are going to win this battle, and Utah will again be in the forefront. Homosexuals can't reproduce, so they recruit, and they are not going to use Utah high school and junior high school campuses to recruit." Which is just a pretty stupid thing to say. So, despite all this, the ACLU did file a suit on the basis that the school district was prohibiting the free speech of queer students. The process lasted 5 years, but the school district eventually withdrew and allowed GSAs to be created, a GSA to be created, but students have to get a parent signature to join, and the club is not allowed to talk about human sexuality at all. So the hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum here is to define what is normal and enforce it. Teachers in Utah say that they live in a climate of fear for their jobs, and this silences them. The traditional family is the norm, and anything that strays from that is abnormal, not right, not legitimate. The LDS Church declared in the fall of 2015 that children who live with same-sex parents are barred from being baptized, confirmed, ordained, are, quote, barred from being baptized, confirmed, ordained to the church's all-male priesthood or recommended for missionary services without the permission of the faith's highest leader, the governing first presidency. So.
All right. Another way that we want to answer the key question here is talking about what are called internal and external discourses, in comparison to discourses of recognition. So external and internal, they both play a large role in the way that LGBTQ recognition is either included or excluded from discourse surrounding curriculum. So in our book, it states that in a situation of external exclusion, we see individuals being denied access to decision-making conversations, as well as participation being limited to those of dominant groups. In an internal exclusion situation, we see individuals or groups, when they don't share the same privileged positions or modes of communication as dominant groups, so therefore they are made unrecognizable. So when we think about how to make a more democratic curriculum, we need to make sure that all perspectives are being recognized and not excluded.
Perfect. And the final key question is, how can we facilitate schools and curriculums that are inclusive and specially just?
Okie dokie. Let me move this here. So these pretty patties are representative of the many aspects of what makes an inclusive curriculum. So before we answer the very last key question, we provided a colorful sampling for your taste buds so that we can have a fuller understanding of these specific concepts. So starting on the lower left, the orange pretty patty representation. This is really about how students experience exclusion from school communities, aka the lack of representation and misrepresentations in curriculum. So if schools are mirroring the discrimination being found in society, then that itself creates an unsafe learning environment for LGBTQ students. Now, the purple patty and the yellow patty can be combined together, and that's recognition and critical thinking. In the reading, we learned that recognition requires students as well as educators to provide opportunities in curriculum to think critically regarding socially constructed hierarchies related to sexuality, class, gender, race, language. Recognition of LGBTQ individuals in public schools allows for exploration and understanding, but also understanding labeling that can dehumanize or even marginalize certain communities and groups.
Perfect. And so positionality is the concept that each person experiences and understands the world in their own unique ways. Intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorization, such as race, ethnicity, class, gender, and sexuality. And third spaces are places that exist outside of normal institutions and systems where dominant norms or power relations are not welcome. These are places where people can communicate or imagine possibilities that are outside of the norm. So in a high school setting, an example of this would be like a GSA club.
Okie dokie. So Isabel has already talked about the case study in Utah, and I'm going to go ahead and talk about California. California specifically has had a really long history of positive reform towards LGBTQ inclusion. Voters brought down what is called the Briggs Initiative, which wanted to exclude lesbian and gay teachers from schools. In California, school programs such as GSA are implemented to support LGBTQ youth. Not only that, but embedded into schools and state law is the FAIR Act, which we will cover in a moment. The California Safety and Violence Prevention Act of 2000, the 2013 AB 1266 Pupil Rights, protecting transgender students and sex segregated activities. So all of these policies recognize and support LGBTQ students in California. And one of the things that really stood out to us was this perception that California is very liberal. All of California is very liberal and forward thinking, which is not true. So one of the things the reading talks about is how in some places, communities could look very similar to that of Utah. And this really demonstrates how it comes down to community. So even in a larger community that supports inclusivity in curriculum, this does not mean that LGBTQ students, teachers, or families feel safe or feel included. We're going to go ahead and talk about the way that curriculum, inclusive curriculum, is embedded into the Californian schools. And these particular themes of inclusion are woven throughout what's called the transformative curriculum. So content is woven across subject areas, not just in one subject area, across all of them. It also happens throughout the year. So there is no, it's LGBTQ month. No, 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 no. So inclusion is intentionally integrated to increase student understanding of themselves, but also their communities. And this particular curriculum is actually very reminiscent of what, oopsies, we're gonna come back to this in one moment, please. What is called the James Banks four-tier approach. But before I go ahead and explain what this is, Isabel, do you want to talk about the FAIR Act?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, so the FAIR Act. The FAIR Act, it stands for the Fair, Accurate, Inclusive, and Respectful Education Act. It is a 2011 law in California that requires school curriculum to include lessons about the contributions of LGBTQ individuals to society. So this law requires teachers to teach about things like the emergence of the nation's first gay rights organization in the 1950s. And this law also includes language about inclusion of other groups too, like Native Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans. So that is something cool that California has put in place. But
All right. Awesome. Thank you.
yeah.
Okie dokie. So we are gonna go ahead and explain this four-tier approach by James Banks in 2010. And we are actually going to be looking at the curriculum of a Californian school of a 11th grade class. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the first two tiers, and then Isabel will do the last two. At the very, very beginning at tier one is contributions. So James Banks introduced this tier model with the idea of helping teachers integrate multicultural content into the curriculum. So at tier one, we might see a teacher introduce holidays or cultural elements or heroes. So at this tier in the 11th grade class, students are introduced to civil rights movement. They learn about female leaders like Rosa Parks, but they're also learning about gay leaders, including Bayard Rustin. At the tier two, which is additive, this involves adding concepts or themes without changing the actual structure of the curriculum. So in the 11th grade class, students were looking at primary sources to learn more about the ordinary lives of Black men and women during the civil rights movement, but they're also learning about how groups such as Hispanics and Asian American, as well as gay and lesbian individuals, and how they campaigned during that time for their own legislative and judicial recognition of civil equality.
Cool. And at tier three is the transformation. At tier three, students view concepts, issues, and events from multiple perspectives. They are asked to question how various movements for equality build upon one another. Students were also asked to think about how issues like education and civil rights for people of color, individuals who identified as LGBTQ have changed or remain unchanged over time. At tier four is social action. Students are engaged in civic engagement, they participate in mock trials or recreating specific cases of the 20th century. Some students participate in debates over issues such as racial or gender restrictions. Overall, Banks' approach nearly fits the curriculum described in this book, and you can really see how this specific model can be used across subject areas, especially with like ELA or social studies. Cool. So as we enter the classroom as teachers, we need to remember that curriculum represents a worldview about what is important for students to learn. So leaving content and perspectives out of the curriculum sends the message that those perspectives and issues don't matter. Schools need curriculum that recognizes every student's uniqueness and positionality rather than privileging one norm. And one way to increase inclusion is Young's process. The process has three emphases, which is greeting, rhetoric, and narrative. It's a framework for increasing recognition and social justice in public school curriculum. So when applied to a LGBTQ inclusive classroom, greeting emphasizes the need for students and teachers to commit to an ethical obligation of teaching and learning within a complex process of recognition. So this is like emphasizing the need to discuss intersectionality and positionality. Rhetoric focuses upon opportunities and constraints involved with norms of communication. So, for example, how some people are dismissed by the public because of their lack of standard English. And narrative involves discussing who is controlling the narrative and how narratives are never neutral. Critical, democratic, and queer discourses increase the variety of non-dominant discourses or non-dominant voices in the classroom. So,
Evaluation. Okay, so this is where Isabel and I are going to kind of give our 2 cents or feelings about the reading overall. And then after that, we will open it up to questions from the audience. Is it okay if I go first, Isabel?
yeah,
You're
definitely.
okay? Okay. So for me, a really big takeaway from this book was how imperative it is to give recognition to all students in school, no matter sexual identity, race, culture, language. And it made me really think about when I will eventually step into my own classroom, or even when we will step into our own classrooms, just the importance of being mindful and aware as possible, especially taking this curriculum studies course and beginning this MED program. I'm realizing more and more of the importance to continue to educate ourselves, and to be able to create more inclusive and safe spaces for students, and that our education and professional development doesn't stop when we finish this program. It's going to be ever developing and ever evolving.
Cool. Yeah, overall, I agree with like everything India just said. I thought this was a pretty good book. I thought the case study between Utah and California was pretty interesting, and I find it kind of remarkable how students can have like such a different experience in school just like based off the state they live in, and um kind of made me happy that I live in Oregon. But I do think this is a good book and provides a good framework for how to be an effective and inclusive teacher, which means constantly evolving, learning, and questioning the norms and normal dominant discourses in your classroom. So,
Excellent. Okay. Now we're gonna open it up and have a group discussion. So I'm gonna stop share so that we can see everybody here.
oh,
Am I
cool.
still pinned? Oh,
No, I just unpinned you.
oh, that's okay. Okay, great. And then whenever you guys are ready,
I have a two-part question for both of you.
hmm
Um, it's my questions are why was the topic of this book important to you? Like why did you choose this book? And then follow-up question, after reading this book, how are you going to personally use your like newfound knowledge to create an inclusive environment in your classroom?
I can start. I feel like I mean, I identify as like some level of queer, and I've always really related to the queer community and found a lot of like friendship and comfort in it. So it is definitely important for me as a teacher to make that available for other kids and be like that type of support for other kids, I guess. And then as far as in the classroom, your second question was like, what are we going to do in our classroom or?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's important to just to include multiple perspectives, include queer perspectives and queer contributions to like science always, and to just it's hard.
you can
Question where we get narratives, question where our curriculum comes from, I guess. India?
No, I really like that you said question where our curriculum is coming from. I
Yeah.
completely agree with that. I chose this book specifically because it's an area that I'm not familiar with. And kind of like I said before, I'm starting to really realize how important it is to educate yourself, especially on topics that are unfamiliar. And I think that with this specific curriculum in the book, this inclusive curriculum, I think that this very much can be, what is the word I'm looking for? It can also, this thought process and way of looking at how to be inclusive also crosses over into our other courses that where we're talking about emerging bilinguals as well. And so I think that, you know, taking this into a real life situation in the classroom, it's all about inclusivity of every single student, but especially having that more specific knowledge of LGBTQ plus community. I think that's really, really invaluable as well, because each community or group, it's important to have that kind of background understanding. I think that will really enforce kind of that understanding for us as teachers.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like you can use like some of the topics talked about in this book for like anybody and increase inclusion of so many different groups. And it's just like a good mindset to have as a teacher. Um, yeah, I like it.
Thanks, Ricardo.
Um, Sorry, no, I'm gonna chime in here. First of all, great presentation. I love the SpongeBob theme. I thought that was really fun. So thank you for that. That was kind of a nice flashback there. Um, I had two questions. So the first one, I was just curious as to the setup of the book itself. Like you discussed a lot of case studies, and it sounded really interesting. And I was just wondering how the book uh like compared them, or kind of like what approach the book took, like as a whole, if that makes sense. And then my second question has to do with a reading actually we did in class a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was like last week. I don't remember. But it discussed homonormativity,
Mm,
essentially. And I don't know if you guys read that article, but it was essentially about inclusion of LGBTQ students being limited to certain narratives. So, like, think Modern Family, for instance, where there's like two husbands and they have kids and stuff like that. So the article was essentially about, yeah, inclusion being limited to LGBTQ members who like were married or, yeah, fit into these kind of cisgender stereotypes, maybe. I was just curious if the book addressed that at all as well.
Mhm. Let's start with that because something came to mind really, really fast. Thank you, Jessica. So, unfortunately, I was unable to read the homonormativity reading, but when you were talking about how individuals were being limited to certain narratives, that actually brought to mind part of the book that Isabella and I read about what's called position. Am I saying this right? Positionality,
yeah.
way that we view ourselves, the way that we view others. And we found this perfect SpongeBob picture of Patrick and SpongeBob as a couple with the little baby stroller and the other fish looking at them like, huh, is that normal? And I think and you can help me out, Isabella, if you want to add anything. This is just what I'm remembering. Positionality, really about kind of deconstructing, well, at the very core, when we're walking down the street and we see somebody, or it could be an individual, it could be a couple, it could be a group, right? The way that our viewpoint kind of influences, I guess, our own biases or the way that we view other individuals. But I think that part of this inclusive curriculum is to be cognizant of those viewpoints, but then also be able to think critically and be able to kind of acknowledge our own positionality and the positionality of others.
Yeah. Yeah. They don't really like, yeah, they don't really touch on the homonormativity or anything like that in the book. They do talk about like heterosexual and cisgender people being like kind of the norm, um, and questioning that norm. But that's kind of all that that's all that how they really get into that, I think. But as far as like the like setup of the book, it starts out just kind of defining like what a democratic education looks like and queer theory in schools. And then there's a chapter on Utah and the LGBT issues in Utah, a chapter on California, and then just a chapter on like social justice and how to be like LGBTQ inclusive in your classroom. So,
There is a very brief section where the author compares Utah and California, but it's not super in depth. And in the case study, at least for California, when we were talking about the curriculum of the 11th grade class, it's all just kind of bullet points. This and then this and then this and then this, kind of walking you through the stages of their unit on civil rights.
mm.
That's okay. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, guys. You guys did amazing. The presentation is beautiful, and I learned a lot. And I guess I just have two questions. So the first question is, I'm I'm just wondering. So you guys mentioned about the case study from Utah and California. So are there only two case study in the book? Like, if there's any other state in the book that mentioned about like LGBTQ inclusion, like curriculum? If yes, is there anything else on the other state that really stood out to you? And also another question I have is, um, oh, let me look for my note just one moment.
Well,
Found it.
oh, I can answer the
Oh,
first one.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the Utah and California are the only like states that they profile. They don't talk about any other states. I wish they did. It would be cool to hear like what's going on in Oregon, but they do include like some nationwide facts and experiences of LGBT students.
I think one of the biggest parts of the case studies was providing readers a lot of background knowledge about the history of those particular communities and the context with which there was inclusivity or no inclusivity of LGBTQ students.
All right, thank you guys. And my second question is, like, what I wonder if the book mentioned like what role do like LGBTQ students play in shaping the development of this inclusive curriculum, and like how can their voices be like more effectively incorporated in this like programs?
Mhm. Student voices. I think that falls into the category of our pretty patty about critical thinking. And even in the Californian case study, they were giving students the opportunity to participate in classroom debates or even quasi-faux trials. Um, and with critical thinking, not just thinking about ways of how classrooms could be more inclusive for LGBTQ youth, but also being supported by teachers to address inequalities, like pinpoint inequalities, pinpoint points of awareness that need to be talked about. So there, part of it is, okay, what can we do to be supportive? And the other half is, okay, but what are the things that we're seeing that are not equal or that need to be supported more? I imagine it to be like a Socratic seminar situation where students can have the chance to really talk about those things. And that was actually in another reading that we read as a class, or was that in another? It may have been 616, but it was the reading about the students who did the Socratic seminar.
Mm.
Um, who identified as LGBTQ, but there are also students who struggled a little bit more because they didn't they didn't have the background knowledge to be able to speak about those experiences.
Yeah. And I think like it's tricky because the issue with, when you talk about like Utah is like the students are trying to get involved and they're trying to like learn about LGBTQ and issues and lives and they're trying, but they're just like met with so much backlash from like the public and administration and things like that. Um, but even despite all that, at the end of the chapter, they did say that there has like the number of GSAs in Utah has just been increasing like every year since the 90s. So I don't know. That's good.
That is good.
It's good.
That's good to end on a positive note.
Yeah.
So, Isabel, how are we on time?
I it's been like 37 minutes.
Oh,
So we
very
did
good.
we met it, I
Nice,
think.
you guys. Thank you so much for joining, everybody.